Good morning. Welcome to the Rainham Channel. We're in Plymouth, Massachusetts. I'm standing here with Tim Turner, who is a reenactor and a Native American historian with Plymouth Plantation. He also does walking tours with a Native American perspective to tell that side of the Pilgrim story here in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We're here on the waterfront with the Pilgrim Memorial, with the Plymouth Rock actually behind us, with a great portico that was built back around 1920, and a great view of Plymouth Harbor with Saker's Point out beyond us, which was a Native American gathering site for clams and scallops and all types of seafood that were part of their diet many years back. Well, good morning, Tim.
Good morning, how are you?
Good, great to be with you.
Welcome to Patuxent or Plymouth here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. One of my favorite spots, by the way. My wife and I are down here most of the week at one time or another.
It is a great spot, one of my favorite places in Plymouth.
We're going to be visiting a number of different sites with Tim as we journey around Plymouth Harbor and the downtown area, including a visit to Governor William Bradford's gravesite. Can you tell us something about this particular hill that we're standing on?
Yeah, we're on Coles Hill, and Coles Hill is where a lot of the original pilgrims that died aboard Mayflower that first winter were buried in the hill front here. And they buried them at night because they were they didn't want the natives to see how many of them were dying that first winter. And so they buried them at night, buried them in the Coles Hill here. And originally the whole waterfront area here was filled and to make the parks that you see here. Originally the ocean came right up to the bottom of Coles Hill.
Oh, interesting. Wow. I noticed that there aren't any markers per se to tell us exactly where some of the first graves were. Is that because the hill has been reconfigured, or?
Well, a lot of the graves were discovered around, I believe it was 1723, when there was a bad ocean effect storm, and it washed the hill away here, which exposed a lot of the pilgrim bones that were here, and they were taken and originally put into a little lead box, and was put in the original portico that went over Plymouth Rock here. And when they reconstructed the new portico, they decided to take the bones in that little lead case and build a more fitting memorial, which is the sarcophagus, which I see over here.
So I guess Mother Nature did what she was intending to do. There wasn't much left for them to gather in terms of the actual remains of these people.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of the remains that they found, but they found bones. They do talk about finding the bones.
Oh, is this also a Native American burial site?
We certainly buried in on top of hills like this. When the pilgrims first arrive here, they are exploring, looking for a place to set up suitable homes and gardens and such, and they remark on seeing native bones all over the ground here. And a plague had struck here between 1616 and 1618, and the 2,000 people that lived here in Patuxent, all of them were lost to this plague. Any survivors moved away. And so the pilgrims actually talk about seeing abandoned cornfields, houses that were in disarray, and bones, bleached bones of the native people all on the ground. And that just really tells me that that was such a devastating plague that they couldn't even keep up with the burials of their dead, and they had a high respect for their dead.
Now, what about the rock itself? Is there any truth behind actually landing at, near, or around a rock of this sort?
Yeah, and I think we should go down and take a little look at it, and I'll give you some history on it.
Okay, great deal. Let's do that. We're down here at Plymouth Rock under the great granite portico, and if I'm correct, this is Quincy granite.
That's what I believe. Yes.
Yeah. From my hometown. Yeah, in fact, my great-grandfather was a stone cutter. Who knows? He may have had a hand in this. I don't know.
You never know.
We don't have any records of him. But moving on, down below us here is Plymouth Rock. Of course, with the date 1620, and there is a gigantic crack in this where it's been put back together. And I think Tim might be able to tell us a little bit more about this.
Well, as far as anybody knows, this is indeed Plymouth Rock. And as the story goes, Thomas Fonts in 1741 proclaims this rock as Plymouth Rock, as told to him by his father when he was a child. His father is not one of the original pilgrims who come over on Mayflower, but comes over on a ship in 1623. So only a couple years after the pilgrims landed here. And Thomas Fonts is a young man when a lot of the original pilgrims came here, and that's what really kind of bolsters his story, that he, found out either from his father or from those pilgrims that were still alive here when he was a boy. Thomas Fonts, most of his adult life, is a record keeper here in the town of Plymouth.
Amazing.
And he's a member of the church for a long time, and that really also bolsters the story that he knew which rock was Plymouth Rock. Now, Plymouth Rock has been moved a couple times. Mm-hmm. It was originally somewhere over near the Mayflower, in front of the Mayflower over there. There's a lot of places where people say, or legends say, where the rock was. But it was moved from its original location in 1774. It was broken off from the ground. It was lifted with 30 sets of oxen. It was placed on a cart where it's moved up to the town green. Some say when they were trying to lift it onto the cart, it fell off and broke in two, and that's the crack that we see in it now. But a lot of people say that crack happened much later. In the early 1880s or early 1800s, that's when it was stamped with the 1620. And it's 1/3 of its original size today. Some say it was over 20,000 pounds, the original size rock. So a lot of trinkets of the rock has been taken, little pieces chipped off, but none since about 1880. There's been a lot of little pieces of Plymouth Rock. If you go to eBay or to other places, you might find people selling bits of Plymouth Rock. Who knows if it's actually Plymouth Rock? It could be.
We were talking earlier that there are pieces at various colleges and universities over doorways and in the lintels of the windows. They're in quite a collection of buildings.
There's a piece of Plymouth Rock at Smithsonian. There's a piece of Plymouth Rock here right in the town of Plymouth at Pilgrim Hall Museum. So there are several pieces of the rock that we know about today.
If we had more time, we'd go to Pilgrim Hall. That's just an amazing place.
It is a great place to visit. It's a really interesting museum, and I don't think enough people take advantage of going to the museum and checking that out. It's really a great museum.
I finally took the time to see it this past spring.
Yeah, it is. So the rock was moved back down here upon the completion of this portico somewhere around 1859. And it's been here since. It's been ceremoniously buried twice by a Native American group in 1970 and again in 1995. No harm, no foul. The fire department came down here, hosed it off. They brought buckets of dirt and threw it on it and buried Plymouth Rock.
Was that during the Thanksgiving period?
Yeah, it was right around the Thanksgiving period. It was a part of the protests that they have down here on the waterfront.
I remember some of the first protests during that Pilgrim's Progress March that takes place here in Plymouth, I guess along the waterfront. And I have to admit that the first time I heard about one of the protests, I was at home watching TV on Thanksgiving Day on the news, watching the midday news, and the cameras were live down here showing the Native Americans up here in Coles Hill and other spots. And I was wondering to myself, what's this all about? And it was only after reading so many books on Native American history, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Dances with Wolves, the King Philip War, amongst others, that I suddenly really began to realize what that side of the story was all about.
Yeah, most native people consider Thanksgiving Day itself a day of mourning.
Yes.
And we have a plaque here in the town that talks about the day of mourning, which was really started by a man named Frank Wamsutta James in 1970. He was asked to come to the town of Plymouth. He was a Wampanoag man. He was asked to come to the town of Plymouth on Thanksgiving Day and deliver a speech in front of, I believe, some dignitaries, some Plymouthians. And so he wrote a speech from a Wampanoag man's perspective. And if you go to the United Native American, UNIE, United Native Americans, we'll have to go up there and look at it. If you go to their website, you can actually see Frank's actual speech. It's about 4 pages. And I challenge people to see what's wrong with his speech. It's a harsh speech. Mm-hmm. It's a Wampanoag man's perspective on the history here.
I think I'd rather deal with the harsh reality than have to look at the colored legend.
Yeah. Well, what happens is Frank writes his speech, and before he's able to deliver his speech, the people who invited him said, "Hey, let's see your speech." And after reading their speech, he said, "There's no way you can read this speech." Or they said, "There's no way you could read this speech." And they actually wrote him a speech. And he said, "There's no way I could read this speech." And so he comes to Coles Hill on Thanksgiving Day, the same day was supposed to go to that conference or go to that dinner and speak. And he reads his speech. And every Thanksgiving Day since then, somebody reads his speech or parts of his speech up on Coles Hill about noontime. And that's a part of the day of mourning protest that happens here every Thanksgiving Day about noontime.
I think I'll take an hour or two and come down and listen to this.
Yeah, it's generally a very peaceful protest, and they're just up there, having their say on Thanksgiving Day. But yeah, I think those people who invited Frank to come to that dinner and speak, they thought they were going to get that kind of that old pilgrim myth, the story of how the natives sat down and had Thanksgiving dinner with the pilgrims, that kind of kumbaya kind of moment. And that's not what Frank was going to do. And if you read Frank's speech, it is strong, and it is from a Wampanoag man's perspective. But I challenge people to see what's wrong with it.
I would probably venture to say there isn't anything wrong.
No.
I haven't read it, but when you listen to something that you've never heard before, and it's read by somebody whose people lived the experience, and that has to be quite meaningful. It has to be true. It has to be something from the heart.
Yeah, I always tell people, listen to the word.
Yeah.
History.
Yeah.
His story. So it's always somebody's story, and that's what makes history so important and interesting. Is it's people's stories.
Yeah.
Sometimes true, sometimes not so true.
Sometimes I'm a little speechless when I hear these comments from you. I speak from the heart when I do this. That I love history, and I'd like to bring history to the present. Let people realize who we are, who your people are. They were here first.
Yep, we've been here.
We came here with a piece of paper saying that we had the right to take this land.
And that's,
but then again, the Native American would ask, why do you take without asking?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about the way the Native people viewed the land here, we didn't believe we owned the land. We believed we were a part of the land, and we believed we were nurturers of the land. And that's why it was so easy for the English to just take over, because we didn't own the land. They wrote out their own deeds.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people know, in 1623 they start something called the land division, and they begin to divide the land up 50 acres per person, and that starts what we know as the English taking over here.
We hear the legends about the rock, we hear the legends about the first settlement here, and yet the story really doesn't mean anything until you read something about the King Philip War and what Squanto found when he returned to his homeland after being taken as a slave several years before. Bones all over the ground. All of a sudden, these new settlers are coming in, and they just happened to come here at the right time in the right place because all of his people were gone, and the land was ripe for the taking.
You got it. Yeah. I mean, there was no one here to say no.
There was nothing else that could be done.
Yeah.
To save that.
Out where the English land really, Provincetown, they didn't find any place out there, so they go to the elbow of Cape Cod to Eastham, and they spend the night on the beach there, and they're awoken early that morning by screams and cries and arrows being flung at them. It was the Nauset people. Yeah. They had seen lots of ships like this one before, and they weren't about letting this one stay. A lot of the ships came, took natives as slaves, and sailed away. Yeah. So the English actually talk about returning fire, and they send their mastiffs off to chase the native people off. And that's the first encounter between the Wampanoag and the English, and it wasn't a good one. And so the Nausets really discouraged the Pilgrims from staying there. And they come here to Plymouth, and there's no one here to say anything about it.
Samuel de Champlain encountered the same hostility down in Stage Harbor in what is now Chatham.
Yeah.
Bartholomew Gosnold got the same thing on Cuttyhunk.
Yep. Yep.
The experiences these people had before.
Yep.
We arrived.
You guys can come around and look at the rock if you want to.
Come on in.
Okay. Want to make sure they see the rock.
We got to keep this on camera.
Yeah.
We welcome anybody to interrupt anytime. Okay. Let's move on to the next site and see what we have to learn about this.
Maybe we'll go up and take a real quick look at the UNIE plaque, and I'll show you that. I should have done that when we were up there, but we'll go up there and take a look now.
Good exercise.
Yeah, sure.
Let's move. Okay, once again, we're back here on top of Coles Hill. There's Massasoit. And we're standing by the National Day of Mourning plaque.
Yep.
Can you tell us about this?
This was installed, I believe, in 1997 as a part of an agreement with the town and the group United American Indians of New England. And that's where I said you could go and find Frank James' speech. If you go to the United American Indians of New England website, you can see the suppressed speech of Frank Wamsutta James. And this is one of two plaques that the town installed in the town. This one is the National Day of Mourning, which is Thanksgiving Day. They do a protest right up here on the hill. There's a large native gathering that's up here at noontime every year, and that is carrying on the tradition of Frank James' speech that he gave here on Coles Hill. And so this is one of two plaques that are in the town, and of course Massasoit is the only native statue in the town of Plymouth. So there are three plaques or statues in the town of Plymouth that are related to native people. And I'm actually working with some of the people here in Plymouth on installing a couple more plaques in the town. Hopefully I'll have some news next year that we'll have these plaques put out. There are two other places that I really would like the town to recognize and to have some information on these two spots. One is the Nemasket Trail, which is known as the Pilgrim's Path, and the other one would be Hobmock's home site, which is on the backside of the John Jenny grist mill. Hobmock was a Wampanoag man that was sent out here by Massasoit to act as a liaison, as a guide, as an interpreter.
I was wondering who he was.
Yeah, and he sent out here to Plymouth, and he lived about 500 yards away from the English village. Today the hill's called Watson's Hill, and he was, from his vantage point, would be able to see from the top of where his home was into the 1627 English village. So he was that close to the English. He was between what the English describe as Hopkins and Howland's lands, which was a part of the land division in 1623. And they said near the south field of the English village. And so there's two spots that I'm working with the town on installing plaques here to the two different groups.
So this is Coles Hill. Now, am I correct to understand, or in understanding, that this is where the stockade or the fort was?
No, we'd have to be up on top of Burial Hill, which will be up there pretty soon.
So it's further a little bit west from the waterfront.
Yeah,
okay.
Leyden Street is just right over here, about 100 yards from where we're standing, and that was the original street that ran up the Pilgrim Village. And the crossroads that are there today are pretty close to where the crossroads were in the time period. But I'll show you where the Fort Meeting House was.
Okay, why don't we venture over there?
Okay.
All right, we're here at the ancient burial ground in Plymouth. This is the oldest burial ground in New England?
In New England, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, this is a site that I have bypassed thousands of times in my life and have never stopped to look around here, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit that, being the history nut that I am. But it's a pleasure to be up here. This is the site of the first fort, where the Pilgrims, for lack of a better description, set up their defenses.
Yep.
Against what?
Well, mostly against other ships sailing in. The English were at war with Spain at that time, and the reason why they built up on this hill was so that they could see, and we'll probably show you some pictures later, all around them. You can see for miles from the top of this hill. And you could see the whole entire harbor. And if a ship was coming in flying the wrong flag, they may be able to blow it out of the water. At least they're going to be able to see it long before it arrives here.
Now, are you familiar with navigation charts and the difficulty of navigating in and out of this harbor?
I can tell you it's very difficult to navigate in and out of the harbor, I'll tell you that much. It's very, very narrow channel. And the Pilgrims are actually not able to bring Mayflower into the harbor here. They actually park it off of Clark's Island, which is about 2 miles out, and they actually row one of their ship's boats that they brought with them into the harbor, and that's how they come into Plymouth Harbor. Yeah,
I understood that part of the story, and I found that interesting that they weren't really able to effectively navigate their way in here. But so how much of the hill here did this first enclosure cover, this first fort?
I've been told by local historians that it was just this kind of general area that we are here, this very crest or very top of the hill.
So it was a very small site.
It was small, yeah. A lot of the pictures of forts from that time period is what they used to reenact or rebuild the one at Plymouth Plantation. And that's modeled after just ones from the period. We have no real recognition or clue what this fort looked like. We just know it was at the very top of this hill. And they did have like a little sentry also, a little spot that they could watch out. But this is where the Fort Meeting House stood. This is where their church was. A lot of them spent that the first year or so in this fort until the houses were built.
Imagining 120 people in an area that probably today would really only accommodate, what, 3 or 4?
Yeah, 100
comfortably.
102 passengers, 104 passengers would have been here. Yep.
Unbelievable.
And most of them spent that first winter on the ship itself.
Yeah.
You know, while they were building houses. That's why so many of them died.
Yeah.
You know, they were dredging in and out of the water. Getting colds, flus, sicknesses, bringing that aboard.
Never mind poor sanitation.
Yeah, poor sanitation aboard. Yeah, Mayflower.
Spoiled food.
Yep. Well, so that's this is where they built the first fort, and you can see for miles. I mean, you can see behind us.
Over toward Manamet.
Oh yeah, over towards Manamet. You can see for forever here, and that's why they really wanted this spot. It was a great vantage spot.
Now, what amongst the Bradfords and the Browns and the Turners, who are the most notable people on this hill that lay at rest here?
Some of the ones that I'm going to bring you to, a lot of the original graves for the Pilgrims that were buried up here were wooden markers, and so they rotted away.
Yeah.
And so there aren't any great markers up here. There is a monument about where Bradford's grave was. There's Thomas Fonce's grave, which I'm going to show you while we're up here.
Now, we keep mentioning Thomas Fonce. Just who was he?
He was the man who said Plymouth Rock was Plymouth Rock, told to him by his father when he was a child. So he's the one who says Plymouth Rock is Plymouth Rock. And what's important is when he does that in 1741, it's lucky he does, because 4 years later he dies. In 1741, some say he was 94, 95 years old. He dies at the age of 99. And so lucky he kind of says, well, you know, this is Plymouth Rock when he does, because, you know, 4 years later he dies, and we may not know what rock the Pilgrim stood on.
Well, being as highly educated as you are in the local history here, was there anything that preceded Thomas Fonce that mentioned a rock?
Yeah, no, none of the original Pilgrims even talk about Plymouth Rock.
So the rock basically is more of a legend?
Legend, myth, but some people actually believe that is the actual rock, and I'm one of those people that believe that it could possibly be the rock. Of course,
it's a fascinating story.
It is a very fascinating story
as to how this whole thing came to be.
Yeah, of course, there's a rock on Provincetown they probably stepped on when they first landed there. I'm sure Provincetown would like to take that credit.
Yeah.
And we know for a fact on Clark's Island, there's a rock out there that people who say was the first rock that the Pilgrims stood on, the first solid ground.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's plenty of rocks around that people want to claim. The other thing that I didn't mention about this is the, you know, where they buried the Pilgrims. Those first original Pilgrims were buried up here. But prior to that, this was a burial ground for Native people. Again, it's a high hill. It's a high hill. We buried our people on tops of hills. And there are actually some artifacts that they found up here, native artifacts that were found up here. So long before it was a burial ground for the Pilgrims, it was a burial ground for the Native people also.
Wow.
So.
Okay, well, let's see a few of the sites around here.
Sure, let's go.
Okay.
But this is Thomas Fonce, the founder of Plymouth Rock, as we know it. And it's certainly one of the things that I bring people up here to see on the tour. It's just a very interesting stone, an interesting grave.
I'm absolutely amazed at this. I say I've never seen the Grim Reaper. I've said this several times in the past several minutes.
Yeah.
But I'm just astonished to see this.
And I believe it's the only stone that has the Grim Reaper. There are 6 stones up here, like I was telling you a few minutes ago, that have actual portraits of the individuals on the stones, which are really neat. So let me take you over to Bradford's grave and Major William Bradford's grave next. And we'll be heading right over here. So this is the grave marker of Governor William Bradford, the second governor of the colony. The first Governor Carver dies that summer out in the field from what most people think was heat stroke. So he's the first elected governor in the town. And we say this is his grave marker because we're not entirely sure where his grave is. Again, marked with wooden marker, rotted away.
So you have to figure an approximate
area. Yeah. His son, Major William Bradford, who I'll tell you about in a minute, says he wants to be buried by his father. Well, Major William Bradford is over here.
Okay.
So it's that's why it's in this proximity.
Yeah.
Some of the things that people will see on the stone, this is Hebrew here.
Yep.
And Bradford gets into the Bible written in Hebrew and also Latin much later in his time period.
I understand he was a scholar of both.
Oh yeah. And Hebrew is read from right to left.
Yep.
And this actually says, Jehovah is the help of my life. And that's what it says in Hebrew. And if you look at the stone here, it says under this stone is the ashes of William Bradford. Everybody go, oh, he was cremated. No, he wasn't cremated. The word ashes is what they use for the body, any body.
Yeah.
So people get a little confused by saying
it's a literal translation of ashes to ashes,
dust to dust. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And it says he's the governor from April of 1621 to about 57.
Yep.
And it says that he was age 69 when he died, And then you read this next sentence, and it says, except for, so he was governor, okay, from 1621 to 1657 until he died at the age of 69. And it says, except for the 5 years which he declined. And everybody sees that and they go, oh, Bradford got really old and he declined. No. No. There was 5 years in which he declined being governor.
Yeah.
Because he said he would be governor as long as they elected him governor.
Yeah.
And apparently those 5 years he said, no way, I don't want to do it. So everybody reads this and they go, oh, he declined, he just got too old to be governor.
I can see where that would be very easily confused.
Yeah, and there's also some Latin here, which I've had loosely described to me, and I'm not thinking of what it says in Latin. I'm not very good in Latin, but this is Latin in Hebrew, and it's just a really interesting.
It's a wonderful marker.
It is an interesting marker, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of people who come up to the graveyard are coming up to look for this this grave here.
Well, considering his prominence in the community or his colony, this is a very simple obelisk. Especially when you look around and you see this large one way over here in the back,
yep,
and some of the elegant granite carved monuments. This is very simple.
If you've not been here to Plymouth to see this graveyard, you can spend hours up here. It's
absolutely,
yeah. And the view, of course, is fantastic from up here. There are days that are clear days that you can see right out to Provincetown, 40 miles across the water. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
The guy I bring most people up here to see is this guy here, who is the son of Bradford. This is Major William Bradford.
Mm-hmm.
And Major William Bradford is well known for leading a militia of the Plymouth colony militia during King Philip's War.
Yep.
And he's known for wiping out an entire Narragansett village during King Philip's War. Him and his men are said to kill all the warriors on the outside. They go into the village, the Narragansett village, where they burn all the houses down.
And all the food stores.
Yeah, and they burn all the houses down, and not a lot of people. Who's in the houses? Women and children.
Yeah.
So he kills over 600 women and children, Narragansett women and children. And so I bring people up here to see his grave because it really shows that second generation of Pilgrims, that second generation of Wampanoag, and how the relationship now has evolved.
Yeah.
It went from helping and trading and being
good neighbors.
Yeah, good neighbors, or what I would call coexisting here, to a whole different sense, where people like Major Bradford is here for is born here and is here for a whole different reason than religious persecution.
Well, who was it that really lit the spark that started this whole thing? Was it Edward Winslow Jr., as some people have said?
Edward Winslow Jr. is definitely one of the people they say sparked King Philip's War. I'm not King Philip's War, but the resistance here. He himself really has a whole different thought than his father on the relationship between the natives, native Wampanoag that were here, and the colonists. And really, he's here, much like Bradford's son, just to take land and to take over. And so it's a total different thought process.
Was it he who asked Benjamin Church and the son of Bradford, William Bradford Jr.?
Yes.
To head up that militia?
Oh yes, yeah, that's what I've heard. The history is so interesting. We barely scratch the surface of history in school today. And that's why tours like this, that's why history like in a town, I really tell people to try to go out and learn as much as you possibly can, because there's just so much out there. Visit your museums, your historic houses.
And engage people such as yourself. Who,
absolutely.
You are the descendant of the people who were here first.
Myself, I'm from the Cherokee Nation, so it's not
Okay.
directly my
But even
people.
so, your people, the Cherokee, suffered.
Oh, quite a bit, yeah.
And they
Trail
froze
of
and they
Tears.
starved to death
Yeah.
during that great Trail of Tears walk.
Yeah, the Indian Removal Act by Andrew Jackson. Yeah. And so
So many misunderstandings have taken place because of minor conflicts. I mean, both parties here in Plymouth were to blame. Yeah, on one hand, we gave them guns and ammunition, basically to ease their lives, make hunting easier. A few young rebellious people in that group of Native Americans might have pulled some stunts that offended the first settlers, but then again, it went both ways.
actually the English had a law right away when they came here. And they say that you could sell no English weaponry to the natives at all. So there's a law right away. It isn't until people like Roger Williams kind of gets himself in trouble here in Plymouth, because he really doesn't see a problem with trading or selling guns to the native people. And Plymouth here says, you got to get out of here. They send him, or he ends up going down to Rhode Island, where he makes Providence Plantation. But he really doesn't have a problem with selling guns and such to the natives. And by the time King Philip's War runs around, some of the best gunsmiths are in fact native people, and they're able to lighten up the weapons enough to make them a better weapon during the war. And so they're actually colonists going to native people to get them to lighten up their gun and make it more serviceable, which is amazing.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. But
it's all the misunderstandings on both sides that led to this conflict, where the English had the upper hand because of the technology they brought with them.
Well, the English got the upper hand in King Philip's War because the Wampanoag were fighting a guerrilla war style. They were reverting into the swamps, and the English weren't able to revert into the swamps. And the Wampanoag were taking their women and children with them. You know, 70% of their diet was vegetables. What are you growing in the swamp? Nothing. After a while, you're exhausting all the animals in a swamp, and so they have to come out of the swamps, and of course that turns the tide for the English, because the English weren't able to traverse through the swamps, not with their muskets and everything else. So you know, what turns the tide in King Philip's War is that they have to come out of the swamps. They can't fight that guerrilla war style, and that just that's what turns the tide in King Philip's War. It's a very interesting war. I tell people it is the first civil war of this country, and it's certainly the most bloodiest war per capita. They talk about 1,200 English homes were burnt to the ground, and they say about the same number of native homes were burnt to the ground, and just heavy losses on both sides. Certainly for the Wampanoag, they had never seen that much blood shed in a war. They didn't, in the 17th century or even before, they took captives during battle. So people didn't lose their lives. They talk about some wars that could go on 11 years and maybe only a dozen people lose their lives. So this war, King Philip's War, was a whole different animal for the Wampanoag, and I'm sure for the English too, but certainly for the Wampanoag, they hadn't seen this kind of loss ever in a war before. So if people have a chance to really look into King Philip's War, it is a fascinating war.
Okay, we are in another part of Plymouth that I haven't been in for years. Tell us about where we are.
We're at the John Jenny Gristmill and John Jenny Pond here, and we're on the back side of the parking lot. And the hill that's right behind us is Watson's Hill, and it is said to be the spot where Hobbamock, who was Wampanoag, was sent by his chief Massasoit to come live by the English, to act as an interpreter, act as a guide, and as a liaison between the Wampanoag and the English. And his home would be on the very crest of the top of the hill here. And I bring you on this side because if we were on the other side, lots of apartment buildings. So this is a little bit more, nature here. As we were discussing earlier, in 1623, the English started something called the Land Division. and they begin to divide up all the land, 50 acres a time, a person. And the reason why we know this is the spot where Hobbamock's home site was a deed that was deeded on this land in 1643. And if you read the deed, the land was sold to another Englishman, and on the deed marks no improvement to the land. The English never considered a native home an improvement to the land, only an English home. So Hobbamock moves here in 1621, and there's a mention of him dying in 1641. There are also little stories about him moving off with Miles Standish, when Miles Standish moves away in 1628. It's one of the reasons why at Plymouth Plantation they only role play up to 1627, because Miles Standish is the first one to move out of the village and move 11 miles away to the town of Duxbury.
Yeah.
And he's what? He's the military leader of the English village. That starts to show you some of the aggression that the Wampanoags aren't doing, that their military leader moves, 11 miles away.
Yeah.
And by 1630, there's only one family left in what we know as the Pilgrim Village today.
Only one?
Only one family. And so they all spread out and took their 50 acres or so, except for this 3-acre piece. And most people go, why? What about those, about those 3 acres? Well, there was somebody living here. That's why no one took this piece of land. Between Hobbamock's land was Hopkins and Howland's lands. And they said that Hobbamock lived between Hopkins and Howland's lands near the south field of the village, and roughly about 500 yards away from Burial Hill, where we were just at.
Okay. Yeah.
And so this spot makes absolute sense. And most of it makes sense because of the description of the hill, because of the descriptions from the deeds. So we know for a fact that this is actually the spot where Hobbamock lived.
Now, has anybody been doing any digging up here in recent years?
Yeah, they've done some, not recent years, they've done some archaeology here. I believe Pilgrim Hall has some of the artifacts. So his house would have been on the top of the hill, and this whole area here would have been where his gardens were.
Oh.
And makes sense. We're right next to the water, right next to John Jenny Pond. And the Wampanoags would have depended on the groundwater to irrigate their crops.
Yeah.
Think about having 3 acres of crops and cups or bowls only this big.
Yeah.
Think about trying to irrigate your crops that way. It's not a...
Yeah, not very efficient, yeah.
No, not efficient at all. So they depended on the rain and also the groundwater.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why we know for a fact that this is the spot. And I am working with the town about putting a plaque or a sign out here that denotes this spot as the spot where Hobbamock lived. And he lived here for over 20 years. I think it's either Winslow or Bradford who says that Hobbamock is actually a good friend. And he probably was in the English village every day, bringing people over to trade, bringing people over to sign other agreements. Because one thing people always think of is that all the Wampanoags signed a treaty with the English. That's not true. It was only one village.
Yeah.
And remember earlier I was telling you there were more than 69 different villages.
Yes.
And one of the points in the treaty in 1621 was that Massasoit was to aid them in signing treaties with all the other groups of Wampanoag. So they only signed a treaty with one group of Wampanoag. Later they may have signed more, but that was the importance of this guy here. He was Massasoit's right-hand man. And as I was telling you earlier, from the hill, top of the hill, he would have been able to see right down into the Pilgrim Village.
Yeah.
Now, Hobbamock himself never told any of the English this, but it's something that that I assume happened is that Hobbamock was also a spy. He could look
being
down.
in this position of course, you say he can look right down in the village. He can see what's going on.
Yeah, and Hobbamock was what we call a panisog, a war chief or a war leader.
Oh.
Who better to come watch the English military and see what they're doing than this war chief, this war leader? You wouldn't send a GI just to go and look at somebody's. You'd send a colonel or a general. Well, that's what this guy was. He was a war leader.
He was upper echelon within the Wampanoag Nation, yeah.
Yeah, he absolutely was. And so it, you know, he didn't go up to Miles Standish and say, hey, put this in your diary, I'm a spy. But it's safe to assume that he
could have been playing friend on one side, but cautious.
Oh, yeah, and reporting back to
and
Massasoit.
wary on the other, yeah.
Oh, and reporting right back to Massasoit. Hey, you know, this happened today or that happened. So,
now, where was Massasoit's home in relation to this?
Yeah, he was about 40 miles away from here, Bristol, Warren, Rhode Island.
Okay.
His village, Pokanoket, means the divided land.
Yeah.
And it was divided by the Narragansett Bay and divided by the Wampanoag and the Narragansett people. And
that's quite a frequent reference in Tougas's book of the King Philip War.
Oh, yeah. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes the Nemasket Trail. And the Nemasket Trail was the trail that Massasoit came down, we know on at least 3 occasions where it's documented. He came down that trail with 60 to 90 warriors.
Okay, so we have the Nemasket Trail between Bristol, Rhode Island, and Plymouth now. Roughly, where would that be on a map today?
The Nemasket Trail originally went 15 miles to the town of Middleborough today, or Nemasket.
Would that be Route 44 or 28?
Yeah,
or
along 44, somewhere
along 44.
around
there.
Okay. When it got to Middleborough, it veered off. So there was the upper Nemasket Trail, and there was the lower.
Okay.
The lower went into the town of Middleborough. The upper went over to Massasoit's community, about 40 miles from this place.
Okay.
And so the Nemasket Trail is so important to the history of that because it's the first path that the Pilgrims talk about going down. And a lot of our paths, or a lot of our highways today and our roadways, were originally Native American pathways.
Yeah.
Like,
and if you didn't have the pathway, you had the Taunton River, which transits quite a large piece of Massachusetts in the southeast side, all the way down to Mount Hope Bay and Narragansett Bay, which is where Bristol is.
Yeah.
So you had really 2 or 3 different corridors of travel.
Yeah, and in the time period, our rivers, our waterways were the ways of our highways in the 17th century. That's how the Wampanoag traversed the land here, by using canoe or by foot. You know, horses didn't get here until the 1640s and 1650s.
Yeah.
So let's head over to the Nemasket Trail. And
so one more question. Is it the aim of the town to keep this land preserved as it is?
It is town land.
Okay.
And I don't know what they want to do with it. I know there's been a lot of conversation about building a memorial or something out here. We'll just see. I mean, we do have 2020 coming up, the 400th anniversary of the town of Plymouth.
Yep.
And I'm a member of the 2020 group who are helping organize.
You're involved in a lot.
I'm involved in helping organize what the 400th commemoration of the town of Plymouth is going to look like.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping memorials are part of that.
Wow.
I'm sure they're going to be, and this would be a good spot to put a memorial.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a wonderful spot.
It is a beautiful spot.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay. You got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the Nemasket Trail here, and it actually goes right down to the Plymouth waterfront, and it goes, today, it only goes about a mile from here.
Okay.
And it does wind through the woods, and but it used to go 15 miles to Middleborough, or 40 miles to Massasoit's community, Bristol, Warren, Rhode Island. And the pathway is famous, made famous by the Pilgrims. This is the first pathway that they talk about going up. But we know on 3 different occasions that are documented that Massasoit came down this pathway with 60 to 90 warriors. The first time is for the signing of the peace treaty in 1621. He comes down this pathway again, that's documented in the fall of 1621 for what we call Thanksgiving today.
Yeah.
And he comes down again with 60 to 90 warriors. And the next time he comes down isn't until, or documented that he comes down, is in 1623 for Governor William Bradford's second marriage. His first wife, Bradford's wife, falls overboard in P-Town, and she drowns. Most people, she thinks she drowned.
I wasn't aware of that.
There are some people who are conspiracy theorists
Yeah.
and said that she was pushed overboard or she leapt overboard. She was a very Christian person, so most people don't think that she killed herself, but there are some conspiracy theorists that said either she had help overboard or she killed herself. But what we know is that she's on the boat one minute, they can't find her the next, and they actually never find her body, but they just assume that she drowns. So he remarries in 1623, and Bradford invites Massasoit and the native people to his marriage.
Now, who was his second wife?
Oh, is it Dorothy? I can't remember who his second wife is. But I think it is Dorothy, if I'm correct. And so Massasoit goes to his wedding, and it's said Massasoit, out of respect for the English, only brings one of his 5 wives to his wedding.
Only one of 5.
Of his 5 wives to his wedding. I also think that when the English describe the native people in the time period of having more than one wife, they generally had that principal wife, that first wife, and all the other wives were helpers to that first wife. So it may be an English kind of description calling them wives. They may have just been helpers to that first wife. But we know that Massasoit had 5. So,
good Lord,
what the English consider 5 wives. So out of respect to Bradford and out of respect to the Pilgrims, he only brings one of his 5 wives.
Wow.
So he would have come right down this pathway. And today a lot of people walk this pathway and have no clue what it is. There is...
or who walked here.
Or who walked here, which is the more important thing. And there are some little signs, they're like triangular signs. There used to be one out here that have a pilgrim hat with a fish on it, and it says Pilgrim's Path. But we know it as the Namaska Trail. And trails like this, as I was telling you earlier, really began to be created into our highway systems as we have today. Route 44 is an example. That was a native pathway. Route 95, going right down the East Coast to Florida, a Native American pathway. Of course, the Mohawk Trail, as we know.
Route 2,
and Route 66 was a Native American pathway. So a lot of pathways like this one shaped our country into our highway system. And these were created by the native people.
Wow. One thing I wanted to touch on before we cut this program off is to ask you about the relationship between the Cranberry, the Native Americans here, and the English. What is that all about?
We always have it on the table for Thanksgiving, right? Cranberries. There was no mention of cranberries ever being at the first Thanksgiving, or what I call the harvest feast that the English and the Wampanoags actually joined together in. But we know that there were cranberries here. The Wampanoag referred to cranberry as, I think the word is sasaminiash, which loosely translates out to tartberry. Makes sense. So the cranberry in the time period didn't grow on a bog. It grew on a bush.
Really?
So they were like cranberry bushes. Today they've been tamed into bogs as we know it.
Into trained vines, actually,
trained vines. And that's, for New England, is one of our biggest crops is cranberry. That's where Ocean Spray is, right here.
Did it play a part in the Native American diet?
Oh, absolutely, cranberries would have been dried and saved for the winter months. It's what we added to our soups to get that sweet flavor in there. It's what we added to our breads that we made. We made tea out of cranberries. So cranberries were a big part of our diet in the 17th century. Any wild edibles or nuts or berries would have been dried and preserved for the winter months.
Was there any mention of the first feast and what actually transpired?
Was
there suspicion on both sides?
I don't know if there was suspicion. Most descriptions of that first, what we call Thanksgiving, and really it was a harvest festival, comes from Winslow. And there's 4 sentences that he mentions about Thanksgiving. He says their harvest gotten in that they were celebrating. and that they sent 4 men a fowling, and those 4 men in a day's time caught enough fowl to serve the company about a week's time.
Good Lord.
Okay?
Yeah.
So now they said fowl. Now nothing about turkeys, but
Yeah.
turkeys are considered fowl.
Yeah.
The English also ate eagle. They said it tastes like mutton, so they could have been eagle on that first.
Wow.
First Harvest Fest.
Yeah.
Mutton is like really old sheep.
Yeah, yeah.
Probably not
Greasy.
very good.
Greasy. I've
Yeah.
had it.
Yeah. So they said, Winslow says that so they're feasting. They've caught the fowl. They talk about exercising their arms, so they're firing off their guns. And he says shortly thereafter, Massasoit arrives, and he arrives with 90 warriors, 60 to 90 men, and he's invited to stay. So there's the invitation. He doesn't get an invitation before.
Yeah.
And there wasn't enough food, so Massasoit sends out 5 of his men. They bring back 5 deer, and they present them to the heads of the town. Now, so we now know they had fresh vegetables, fowl, but we know for a fact they had venison. I don't know about you. Do you have venison on your Thanksgiving table?
Not that I know of.
That's the one thing we know that they had.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most historians, like myself, believe this happened by accident. When are the English having harvest in England? It's October.
Yeah.
So this probably did not happen in November.
No.
So
No.
you're
Too
not
cold.
harvesting anything in November.
Too cold.
What's happening? The English are talking about fouling, so they're shooting off their guns. They're also talking about exercising their arms, shooting off their guns. So most historians, like myself, believe what happened was Massasoit got word that there was a tremendous amount of gunfire coming from the English village. So he leaves his village. Along the way, he picks up warriors from village to village, and he arrives in the Pilgrim village to find out nothing was going on, that they're celebrating. Remember, Massasoit just earlier that year signed a mutual defense treaty.
Well, that's something that a lot of people do in a lot of states on certain holidays. Set off firecrackers. Well, they have firearms competitions on any given holiday.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so most people think that Massasoit hears about all this gunfire. He knows he just signed a treaty with the English to defend them. So he comes to Plymouth to do that, to help defend them, because he hears about this gunfire. And when he arrives, they're celebrating. That's why he arrives with 90 men. If you're invited to come to a feast, wouldn't you bring women and children with you?
Sure.
Absolutely. If you're invited to come to a feast, wouldn't you bring food with you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't even bring food with you. He sends out people to get food afterwards. So most historians believe it happened totally by accident. And it only happened that one time.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of
It does
sense.
make
Yeah.
a lot of sense.
Yeah.
There's things about history that, we have to look at and go, okay, this makes sense. Now, we don't have any written exact information on it, but you have to read what's out there.
To the staff of Plymouth Plantation
Sure.
for graciously lending you to us today,
Yeah.
and for you taking your time.
Yeah. And I encourage people, if you're coming down to Plymouth, look us up, Native Plymouth Tours. www.nativeplymouthtours.com, and come for a visit here in Plymouth. Take a look at our website and see the other side of history that is not very well told. Thank you for coming out.
My pleasure, and thank you. God bless.